Good morning, all, and welcome to today's lecture in Sydney Asian Art Series. My name is Peyvan Firuze, and I'm speaking from the unceded land of the Gadigal people. I'm a lecturer of Islamic art at the Department of Art History in the University of Sydney, and I'm welcoming you today as a member of Board of Directors of VisAsia, the Australian Institute of Asian Culture and Visual Arts at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. Sydney Asian Art Series is a joint project between the Power Institute, the University of Sydney's China Studies Center, and VisAsia since 2017. Every year, the program brings to Sydney 4 visiting scholars from universities and art institutions around the world to present their research on critical issues in Asian art. And the program has provided opportunities for academics and students to work with colleagues across organizations and borders. And with COVID, we've obviously gone online. This program plays a crucial role in cultivating a better understanding and enjoyment of Asian art and culture among the public in Australia. Olivier Krischer has been the convener of this lecture series since 2019, and this year he has assembled 4 leading scholars to consider the question of art and environment. And today we are very fortunate to have Sugata Ray with us. So a very warm welcome to our speaker and to our audience, and I hand it over to you, Olivier, to introduce our speaker.
Wonderful, thank you, Peyvan, and very much thanks to VisAsia, who have been a great supporter of the series. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Art Gallery of New South Wales. Usually we would be sharing these events if we were working in person between the Art Gallery and the University of Sydney. But working online, we are able to also reach a much broader audience, which has brought a silver lining, let's say, to our situation. Welcome everyone. My name is Olivier Krischer. As you've just heard, I'm the convener of the Sydney Asian Art Series, the theme of which this year is art and environment. I'd like to also begin by acknowledging that I'm working and have been raised on the unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and also the Wangal people is where I'm speaking from today, the land of the Wangal people. I'd like to acknowledge and pay respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and recognize the active custodianship and the work of care for country that this acknowledgement hopes to do. I would also like to extend my acknowledgement to all First Nations people joining us here today. It gives me great pleasure to follow Peyvan in welcoming Sugata as our 3rd speaker for the Sydney Asian Art Series in 2021. Each year, the series explores a really broad and timely theme in Asian art history and practice. And our approach is to invite 4 international scholars to try and unpack these themes and to, in some ways, to expand what we think of around these concepts. And this year we've been considering environment and the intersections and correspondences, flows between art and environment across geographies and across different historical periods as well. Our first speaker, Patrick Flores, shared his research on Philippine artist Junyi, who has pioneered environmental engagement with his sculptural installations and site-specific works, particularly through the use of indigenous materials and his concept of learning from the mountain. That was in April. And in May, Furuhato Yuriko spoke on the ecological dilemma of metabolist architecture in mid-century Japan, post-war Japan, symbolic of the spaceship Earth era and the way in which their aspiration, the metabolist aspiration for sustainable architecture, was betrayed on a material level by a reliance on plastics and the petroeconomy. So as you can see, we've moved around, and today we're moving further still. So it's my pleasure to formally welcome Sugata and to introduce. I'll keep my introductory comments brief because I know we have a very strong interest. A lot of people joining us both locally and from overseas, and I don't want to eat up too much of our question time. Sugata, as many of you will be familiar, is Associate Professor of South and Southeast Asian Art in the departments of History of Art and South and Southeast Asian Studies at UC Berkeley. His research and writing have focused on climate change and the visual arts across a broad swathe of history from the 1500s onwards, which is incredible for people working on the narrowest periods of time to try and contemplate. He's particularly worked on areas related to South Asia, though the connections and resonance as we're here today go well beyond that. His book, Climate Change and the Art of Devotion, Geo Aesthetics in the Land of Krishna, 1550 to 1850, which was published in 2019, was winner of the American Academy of Religion and the Arts Book Award. This book is also very much about the potential for ecological engagement, geoaesthetics, as the title suggests, to expand or even transform the scope of art history as a field and practice beyond the exceptional category of the human, or a sort of anthropocentric epistemology. And in that sense, in some ways, it is a call to arms. He's co-editor of Water Histories of South Asia, The Materiality of Liquescence, a beautiful title for a 2020 publication, as well as being co-editor of a forthcoming volume, Ecologies, Aesthetics and Histories of Art, which explores correspondences between nature, ecology, the environment, and aesthetics. I think many of these sorts of themes and ideas we'll see in his talk today, which is actually from a new book project or a current book project expanding on Indian Ocean histories in the age of the Anthropocene. So his title for the talk today, With the Gobble of a Turkey, I think we get a sense of the poetics at work in his research, which is something that I'd certainly like to come back to in the questions. But with that, just a final word about housekeeping. Many of you, I'm sure, this is the age of the Zoomocene, so we're all familiar, but please do put your questions in the Q&A window. So you should see at the bottom of your Zoom screen, if you have a look on the bottom right, there's a Q&A button. Please do put your questions in there rather than in the chat, because it's much easier to track. We have, as I said, a lot of interest, so keep your questions concise so that we can try and discuss more of them. I will be back at the end of Sugata's talk to moderate those questions and the discussion. And with that, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to you, Sugata, to start sharing your screen. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver, for that very kind introduction. Let me begin by thanking the University of Sydney's Power Institute, the China Studies Centre, West Asia, the Art Gallery of New South Wales for inviting me to join the Sydney Asian Art Series this year. And a special thanks to Nick and Mara for facilitating the talk. As we slowly emerge from a global pandemic that has led to unimaginable bereavement and grief, I want to speak today about something that I believe we are all thinking about in one way or the other as we confront the sixth extinction. In particular, I want to turn our attention to a theme that is internal to the conversation around the sixth extinction, the theme of human-animal relations. Every day we hear about the price non-human animals pay for human action. Large-scale bushfire in California and Australia, loss of habitat, extinction. The present moment begs more than ever critical questions about the intersection between the material world and the fellow animals with whom we share it. My first book, as Olivia mentioned, focused on Geo Aesthetics in a pilgrimage town in India. Since then, I have been deeply invested in thinking about non-human actors who leave a deep impression on the history of art, an impression that we often don't account for. For example, the non-human animal. The animal, we know, presents a particular kind of art historical problem, because art history, like any other forms of cultural histories, is primarily focused on human activity. Our protagonists are all too human. So how might we move beyond this human centricism in the humanities more broadly? What would our archives be? And these are just few of the questions that my second book project takes up. And it's a very new project. And I'm very much looking forward to your thoughts, your suggestions. We begin on the 16th of Farvardin, March 25th, 1612, when the emperor of Mughal India, Jahangir, noted in his personal memoirs. I had ordered him, the reference here is to Mukarrab Khan, a high-ranking noble in the Mughal court, to go to the port of Goa on several items of business and see the viceroy, the governor of Goa, and to purchase any rarities he could get hold of for the royal treasury. Without consideration for cost, he paid any price the Franks, that is the Piranese, the Portuguese, asked for whatever rarities he could locate. He had brought several very strange and unusual animals that I had not seen before. No one even knew what their names were. One of the animals was larger in body than a peahen and significantly smaller than a peacock. The animal in question was the common American turkey, the Meleagris calopavo, a bird that had until this time never been seen in South Asia. And here we have it's very badly damaged, but the painting shows the Mughal courtier, Mukarrab Khan, presenting the turkey along with a monkey that he had also purchased in Goa to the emperor. We can see the emperor seated on his throne, and right below on the carpet we have the turkey and the monkey. The emperor sought to comprehend the extreme strangeness of this bird, whose name he did not know, through ekphrasis. Sometimes, when it displays itself during mating, Jahangir continues, it spreads its tail and its other feathers like a peacock and dances. Its beak and legs are like a rooster's. Its head, neck, and wattle constantly change color. When it is mating, they are as red as can be. You would think it has all been set with coral. After a while, these same places become white and look like cotton. Sometimes they look turquoise. It keeps changing color like a chameleon. The piece of flesh it has on its head resembles a cock's comb. The strange part about it is that when it is mating, the piece of flesh hangs down a span from its head like an elephant's trunk. But then when it pulls it up, it stands erect a distance of 2 fingers like a rhino's horn. The area around its eyes is always turquoise colored and never changes. Its feather appears to be of different colors, unlike a peacock's feather. Eventually, the emperor designated Mansur, who had served as a court artist from about 1590 to 1625, to draw its likeness, or tasveer, and this is Jahangir writing again, so that the astonishment one has at hearing of the bird would be increased by seeing it. Echoing the emperor's punctilious description, Mansur's 1612 painting, too, was a careful study, a likeness, or tasveer of the bird. Meticulously applying color in small areas to define the texture and sheen of plumage, the artist depicted the turkey against a tinted background that accentuated bodily presence through naturalistic verisimilitude. Mansur's perceptive representation of the turkey was unprecedented. Compare the 1612 work with an earlier painting by Mansur, a 1594 folio that is representative of the artist's early style. The Indian bustard and the Bengal florican are grounded in a landscape that signals towards the natural habitat of the bird. The turkey, in contrast, hovers in space. Even as each feather and fold of skin is marked by minute brushwork, the body of the turkey floats over a lightly sketched ground demarcated by wild flowers, which its claws do not quite touch. The ground, it seems, is intentionally separated. The subdued background with a monochromatic tint highlights the visceral presence of the word. What compelled Mansur to place the body of the bird at a slight remove from the ground, estranged from its worldly context, as it were? And how could art history have missed such a deliberate estrangement, especially given the immense scholarly attention that Mansur's oeuvre has been subject to in the recent past? The arrival of the Turkey in the Mughal court, I propose, offered Mansur a new visual language for the representation of non-human animals. The painting of the Turkey, in turn, offers us critical insights into both the trans-regional entanglements that constituted the early modern world and the human non-human interactions that shaped representational conventions in this period. Today, we face the sixth extinction, the most cataclysmic mass extinction event in the past 66 million years, that is, after dinosaurs went extinct during the fifth extinction. And these are just a few of the species in the Indian Ocean region that have become extinct in the age of what the historian Alfred Crosby has described as ecological imperialism that began in the 1500s. As we face this human-induced sixth extinction, can a renewed attention to human-animal relations alter art history's speciesist bias with a root in Enlightenment rationality? As a discipline, art history takes objects, structures, and artistic representation produced by the human species as its principal archive and locus of analysis. Accordingly, artists, their patrons, and their audiences emerge as the primary agents in this history. But how, we might ask, could a painting such as this, returning to Mansur's Turkey, intercept the economy of relation between human and non-human animals? Writing an art history that works against its own anthropocentrism presents a conceptual challenge. For our access to the non-human animal is limited to an anthropocentric archive. Animals lack language that is proper to the human. Put differently, the turkey's gobble is unintelligible to the human ear. We will never know what this turkey that reached the Mughal court in 1612 sensed or expressed. The turkey in this sense resists history, eco-critical or otherwise, functioning as the one who cannot be heard. Thus, rather than recovering the real animal or abstracting non-human life into an allegory, visual representations read obliquely, read against their grain, might make visible, albeit partially, the economy of relations between humans and non-human animals. How might we think with and of the turkey in a way that does not reduce its presence to another aspect of human history? By rereading the 1612 painting, reading it now with the turkey, with Mansur, with Jahangir, I propose we begin a process that could lead to an art history where we see this painting as not only a product created by a stable human subject, that is, the artist Mansur, but also as an outcome of interspecies relation that shaped representational registers in the early modern world. The story of the turkey that reached the Mughal court in 1612 is not surprisingly deeply intertwined with an early modern global economy of the collecting and gifting of exotic animals. Of the numerous unusual animals that circulated across vast oceanic spaces in this period, the rhino from Gujarat that arrived in Lisbon in 1515 is perhaps the best known today. The animal circulation in Europe was, as scholars have noted, symptomatic of an early modern global trade that arose in conjunction with new forms of collecting, new natural philosophies, and a parallel attempt to master the natural environment through new pictorial technologies. Scholarship on the global circulation of animals from Asia, Africa, and the Americas has largely centered on animals that entered European menagerie, became subjects of European scientific representations, and thus accrued value within a European political economy. The practice of collecting exotic animals was, however, not limited to Europe. Collecting unusual animals was an equally important facet of Indian Ocean trade in this period. The Emperor Jahangir, for instance, maintained a menagerie that housed rare animals such as zebras, for instance, this painting on the screen, giraffes, and a dodo. The zebra, which was acquired from Abyssinia in 1621 and also painted by Mansur, was subsequently gifted to the Safavid Emperor Shah Abbas. One could perhaps read such circulation as part of a reciprocal economy of gift exchange, for in 1619, Shah Abbas had presented Jahangir with a gyr falcon, a bird that Jahangir also ordered Mansur to paint. Thus, in the context of the Indian Ocean world, animals such as elephants, zebras, rhinos, and giraffes were routinely shipped as part of diplomatic gift exchange for imperial spectacles and as symbols of power and prestige, in process intensifying the biopolitical foundations of early modern empires. I'm sorry. It is in this milieu of a global trade in rare animals that we must also place the turkey that arrived in the Mughal court in 1612. In the recent past, art historians have explored the symbolic significance of the bird as it reached Europe in the 16th century. But the global or worldly scope of and scale of the bird's dissemination has not been addressed by art history. As we now know, although Spanish conquerors such as Cortes must have encountered turkeys in Mexico, the bird reached Europe in 1520. By 1522, the bird was included in a fresco in the Villa Madama in Rome, alongside other exotic animals such as peacocks and ostriches. Although the bird was still considered a rarity, its spread was rapid. By 1530, only 9 years after Cortes had conquered Tenochtitlan, the turkey had been well established in Europe. The bird was in Germany in 1530, in France and England by the 1540s, and in Scandinavia by the 1550s. By the mid-16th century, representations of the bird also started appearing more frequently, including a life-size bronze for an artificial grotto in a Medici villa near Florence. The bronze was placed in the grotto alongside animals such as a unicorn, lion, elephant, giraffe, camel, and a rhino. The placement of the turkey alongside recognized exotic animals such as giraffes and elephants that were avidly collected by the European elite suggests that the bird had a valorized place in the European imaginary. This exalted nature of the bird was, I would suggest, because of its novelty. The turkey had not been seen in Europe before. By 1612, the bird had reached India. In 1617, a request for turkeys for Shah Abbas was dispatched to London by officers in charge of the company's mission in Safavid, Iran. By 1674, the turkey had also reached China through a woodblock world map produced by the Jesuit priest Verbies for the Qing emperor. Both Turkeys, the one in Verbies' map and the other painted by Mansur, had a close affinity with the woodblock print published in the Italian naturalist Aldrovandi's Ornithology. In all three instances, the turkey is portrayed in side profile with outstretched wings and tail feathers upright. But this is where similarities end. The bird in the Aldrovandi book stands on a mound flanked by oryza or Asian rice, and I'll return to this environmental citation shortly. In Verbies' world map, vegetation is replaced by lines to signify the ground upon which the bird is perched. Mansur's turkey, in contrast, floats in air, disassociated both from the flora on the ground and the world that it assumedly inhabits. Perhaps pictures from Europe did offer the artist a model to experiment with a more naturalistic approach to physiognomy. Around the time he was directed by Jahangir to paint the turkey, Mansur had indeed started painting naturalistic floral studies based on plant illustrations in European herbals. Had Mansur also studied Aldrovandi's woodcut or a similar image that is yet to be discovered? And where, one might ask, did the bird that arrived in the Mughal court in 1612 fit in this history of the global circulation of images, techniques, and style? The social life of the 1612 painting certainly highlights the trans-regional circulation of Mughal paintings. At an unknown date, the album was dismembered, and this page was part of a group of folios that was gifted to the V&A, the Victoria and Albert Museum, in 1921 by Lady Wantage, a British art collector. The 33 paintings gifted to the museum were bought in London in 1867, that is within 10 years of the British looting of the Royal Library in Delhi by Baron Overstone on the occasion of his daughter, that is Lady Wantage's 31st birthday. But even before it reached London, the painting had been framed at some point by bands of verses, for instance, on the top, calligraphy by Mir Ali of Herat, whose calligraphy was highly sought across the Safavid, Ottoman, and Mughal worlds, and the 18th century border of gold-painted flowering plants. These histories are both well known and indeed well explored. My own interest lies in the animal. Art historians have limited their reading of representations of animals, exotic or otherwise, in Mughal paintings as standing in for the symbolic. Lions, elephants, and other animals, scholars have noted, assumed allegorical meaning within a system of kingship centered on the oratic presence of a worldly cosmopolitan monarch. Paradoxically, what is omitted in this otherwise insightful engagement with the global histories of Mughal painting is the physical presence of animals in the court. Rather than seeing the bird as an absent trace or merely an amalgamation of lines, shapes, and colors in the hands of the artist Mansur, an animal studies perspective urges us to take seriously the corporeal presence of the turkey. Such a reading, however, must proceed with caution. Unlike a sovereign subject with authorial intent, the animal does not leave a trace in the archive, unless, of course, we take into account paintings by Congo, the celebrated chimpanzee in the London Zoo, and other imprisoned animals trained to paint by their human captors. Consequently, we might concede that there is no real animal, a historical subject, to be found in art history's species-level archive. It is solely from within the domain of representation that we will have to unearth the minor ruffles caused by the turkey that appeared in the Mughal court in 1612. Nonetheless, the effects of the bird's presence, we will see, were significant for the history of art. In art history, Mansur has now gained distinction as one of the greatest natural history painters of all time. Scholars have remarked on the artist's perceptive representation of flora and fauna and fine-line brushwork that tenderly captured the physiognomy of animals. Mansur had begun his career in the early 1590s under the Emperor Akbar. His signature first appears in this copy of the Baburnama, that is the memoirs of the first Mughal Emperor Babur. We can see that there is a keen attentiveness to the natural world already perceptible in the artist's early works. Art historians have argued that the artist, under the guidance of Jahangir, a consummate naturalist, subsequently inaugurated a new turn in Mughal painterly cultures, one that brought to the forefront a keen attentiveness to the natural world that was possessed, controlled, and governed by the imperium. Without doubt, Mansur's documentary eye paralleled his patron's project of systematically recording and describing the natural world in his imperial memoirs. Think of his description of the turkey. It is thus no coincidence that Jahangir, an avid collector of curiosities, had ordered his courtier to purchase rarities from the markets of Goa during trade negotiations with the Portuguese. Mukarrab Khan, the courtier, returned to the Mughal court with a turkey and a Southeast Asian monkey. Subsequently, Jahangir asked Mansur to draw a likeness or tasveer of the bird, a practice that was not uncommon in the Mughal court. Along with illustrations in imperial chronicles, a number of independent single folio paintings of birds had been produced by artists in the court. Such paintings inevitably evince an attempt by court artists to locate birds in either an imaginary landscape or in the natural habitat in which animals are found. For example, the painting on the right, the artist presents the two birds, rosy pastures, near grasslands in the edge of an urban center, which is visible at the background. And we know that migratory rosy pastures do indeed appear in vast numbers in North India during winter and are often seen feeding on insects in agricultural land. The painting of the turkey, however, belonged to a different documentary order, but one whose aesthetic structures was already being shaped during the first years of Jahangir's reign. Mansur's 1610 painting of a hen is a case in point. Although a prosaic subject in comparison to the extraordinary animals that the artist would soon depict, the painting offers an indication of the experiments that were unfolding in the court. The hen is depicted in side profile with wings outstretched, the plumage painted with great care. Yet, unlike the 1612 turkey, the hen and a chick are grounded in space. Despite abjuring his early practice of incorporating hills and water bodies, for instance, in the 1594 painting we saw from the Baburnama, Mansur places the hen in a swath of deep green pigment that gradually fades into the horizon to create a sense of depth and recession. By the time Mansur painted his turkey, attempts to demarcate a landscape as the background was, however, completely abandoned. We will never know why Mansur deliberately effaced context, that is, the landscape, to underscore the bodily presence of the bird. But something was afoot. Perhaps Mansur's painting was a pictorial response to European nature studies that were circulating in India. Much like Aldravandi's turkey, Mansur's bird is presented in side profile with only a hint of vegetation in the immediate foreground. Or perhaps Mansur had never encountered Aldravandi's book, and the painting was a logical conclusion of Mansur's own creative experiments that began in the 1590s. It is, however, worth emphasizing the technique of presenting an isolated animal against a blank background was, at least in 16th century Europe, representative of what Janis Neri has described as an emergent specimen logic, a form of knowledge production that turned nature into object by decontextualizing select creatures and removing them from their habitats, environments, and settings. It is within this context of an early modern humanist natural history that Aldravandi's woodblock of the turkey functioned as a specimen of America's avifauna. It is also within this system of the scientific study of the natural world that the bird came to allegorically signify Europe's claim over the Americas. The bird, however, had a very different career in both China and India. In Asia, the bird was not embedded within the discourses of ecological imperialism that marked Europe's interest in the Americas. Instead, the turkey was indicative of an increasing awareness of the Americas that was external to the logic of colonial domination. Thus, along with acquiring a turkey in 1612, Jahangir, for instance, had started cultivating pineapples in Agra with plants from the obtained from the Portuguese. The American fruits also starts appearing in textiles. And in this example on the screen, we can see an ascetic really contemplating this very strange fruit from far away. The biocultural effects of the Colombian exchange in Mughal India were then surely rooted in a very different conceptual register, a system that was epistemically unlike the imperialist ambition of European seaborne expansionism. Thus, one would need to go beyond the totalizing aesthetic arrangements of European expansionism to comprehend the blank background in Mansur's painting of the turkey, despite formal similarities to European nature studies. Rather than seeing Mansur's painting as only conveying allegorical or emblematic meaning, we might instead take seriously the irreducible presence of the bird in the court. The act of seeing an animal is inevitably a reciprocal relationship, a dynamic and entangled complex of differential action. And this has been explored in a number of disciplines. The turkey, one could contend, following this line of reasoning, was above all itself, performing its self. When the turkey was performing before the observing Mansur and Jahangir, surely the artist and his patron were implicated in spite of the primacy of activity on one side of the human-animal continuum. Mansur's painting could then perhaps be read as an intersubjective transcript of that interspecies continuum, functioning against its own epistemological intention as a trace of the animal's presence. Conceivably, it was the strangeness of a bird from elsewhere whose neck turned as red as coral that necessitated a new language that could transcend context and belonging. And we must also remember that unlike animals such as monkeys, the god Hanuman, and serpents, semi-divine beings in Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism, these animals were both agents and had agency within Indo-Islamic cultures. The turkey did not belong to an interspecies topography enunciated through mythopoetic narratives of shape-shifting creatures or the prominence of certain animals, for instance, horses and elephants in courtly cultures. The turkey thus found itself in a state of double alterity, or a specific relation of subalternity, unable to speak from this othered position. For not only was it the irreducible other, that is, the non-human, but its unbelongingness excluded it from interspecies affiliations that marked Mughal interactions with other more recognizable animal species. It was perhaps this double alterity that did not find recognition within established visual repertoires of the court. But turkeys, we must admit, are most peculiar birds. In the English-speaking world, no one can fail to notice that the bird and a country share the same name. In 1755, the British lexicographer Samuel Johnson had described the bird as a large domestic fowl brought from Turkey in his dictionary of the English language. In Turkey, that is the country, the same bird was known as Hind, after Hindustan or India, where the bird was supposed to have originated. Most parts of Europe, too, associated the bird with India. Accordingly, even though the turkey was from the Americas, Aldrovandi had described the bird as gallo pavo, or chicken peacock, and depicted a sheaf of Asian rice to signify the Indian provenance of the bird. Peru, the name adopted in Jahangir's memoirs and Verbier's map, was in contrast perhaps the most appropriate in this context of chronic misnaming and misrepresentation, since Peru referred to the Spanish viceroyalty of Peru. Despite the error in locating the bird as originating in Peru rather than in New Spain, the natural habitat of the turkey, the designation Peru articulated an incipient 17th century cognizance of the circuits that connected the Americas to Asia beyond Europe's global colonial aspirations. Mansur's 1612 painting of the turkey was only one of the many unusual animals that the artist would paint over his career. And even a cursory glance of Mansur's paintings of exotic animals, the zebras and gyrfalcons, indicate that the animals were affected by an increasing decontextualization in the artist's hand. If the 1612 turkey gently hovered over a landscape, that its claws quite did not reach, the Central Asian falcon, painted 7 years later, was presented on a perch that stood upon an entirely unmarked background. Painted 2 years later, the zebra remained tightly tied to a stake, driven to the ground. Yet, unlike earlier paintings of animals, for instance, this ram from 1585, the ground remains indistinct in Mansur's painting. Not a single clue betrays the animal's precise placement in the world. The burden of precision, of precise likeness, rests entirely on the animal. Rather than reading this transformation in Mansur's oeuvre merely as a signifier of human attitudes towards animals, we could reconsider the 1612 encounter between Mansur and the turkey from a perspective where we see the animal's presence as constitutive rather than emblematic. It was, I argue, the strangeness of the animal confronting the artist that necessitated a new language, a new mode of visualizing ground and horizon in relation to the subject, one in which there was no context or background in which to place the bird. Mansur's painting of the turkey was emulated by a number of artists. In each instance, the turkey is presented in side profile, floating against an indistinct background. And I'm so sorry for the bad quality of the painting on the right. estate is under litigation and scholars don't have access to the work. By the 18th century, this technique of presenting animals against monochromatic flat backdrops had spread across South Asia. Nevertheless, my reading of Mansur's painting of the turkey, I must admit, is capricious without empirical evidence, the bedrock of art history's Enlightenment roots. Yet there is no Turkey archive that can offer verifiable insight into the fateful encounter between Mansur and the bird. There is, I must thus also admit, no real Turkey in art history's archive. Our art historical archive is consequently limited to Mansur's painting and a few paragraphs penned by the Emperor Jahangir. Thus, given the impossibility of other forms of archival retrieval, it is the 1612 painting that has to be pushed against its own anthropocentric limit to locate the cross-hatching of interspecies mediations. However, as a shadowy figure in history, as the one who left no trace otherwise, the turkey does not allow for a liberal humanist recovery of an ethico-political subject called the animal. Rather than offering liberatory narratives of agency, empowerment, or subjectivity, the 1612 painting, at its best, obfuscates Enlightenment species boundaries to make way for a porous art history, a more than human art history, in which the other, animal or otherwise, dwells in difference. Does the turkey care for such an entangled art history? Unlikely. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sugata. Does the turkey care for our art history? It's a great way to open up our questions. We have a couple of questions that resonate very much with this concern as to the other than human archive. But I'll begin perhaps with more practical sort of matters. And so one of our first questions is about your comment around the representation of Turkey's mating in Mansur in Jahangir's court, which suggests that there may have been a pair of turkeys. Was there a pair of turkeys? Do you know more about the presence of other turkeys, let's say?
I mean, that is a very good question. And we know from archival evidence that within a few years, Thomas Roe, for instance, would write to England saying that the emperor has 4 cocks, but no hens. And he would love some turkey hens. But the point, so in a way, there was a great desire for more turkeys in Mughal India. But I have spoken to a lot of ornithologists about this question, and I've always wondered about this, is that what was the turkey seeing when he was mating, as Jahangir so beautifully described it? And a lot of my colleagues who are specialists in the science of in ornithology have told me that the turkeys apparently do their mating ritual for other animals as well. So perhaps the turkey was responding to another animal. We will never know, and that is sort of the dilemma of the archive here. We will never know what was the turkey responding to when he displayed his mating ritual. But it really opens up a question of sort of even the menagerie. Where was the turkey kept? What was the turkey seeing? And if we are going to talk about the perspective from that particular, the corporeal presence of the animal, and all we have access to is a painting, it leads to more questions than we can answer.
I guess that also brings to mind your point on this being an interspecies, transcript of interspecies sort of relations, rather than some kind of pure image of a turkey as a historical being. We have another question actually on a different part of your talk, which showed an image of elephants fleeing what appear to be sinking boats. And our audience member says this brings to mind Tansen Sen's work on floating cosmopolises, And could you comment on the mechanics of how these exotic animals were transported? So you've talked about a lot of circulation. Do you know more about that?
So there is some recent work that's emerged recently that really talks about the infrastructure required to move these megafauna. That's the term used. How the charismatic fauna, like these huge animals. I mean, to imagine what it takes to take a rhino from Gujarat to Lisbon, not only maritime infrastructure, but also thinking about the knowledge of what the animal eats, what sort of food is required. So often we know that when we have animals moving across these vast oceanic spaces, you would also have keepers moving. So, for instance, this very, very well-known example is the giraffe from Bengal that lands up in China. And in the paintings, for instance, the one in the MFA Boston, you see the representation of a South Asian. So not only were the animals moving, but there were keepers who were moving, who carried the knowledge that was required to safeguard these animals. And these were very expensive processes to move a giraffe or a rhino from across the world. And we also know that very little of these animals survived. Most animals would die in the passage and would be chucked overboard, literally. So again, what we see in terms of visual representations or archival evidence, whether in Europe or South Asia or China, is only a very little part of this larger trade in exotic animals.
Thank you. I'm going to skip a little bit ahead to another question, sort of practicalities, but there's a question as to what you're referring to when you say the Indian Ocean world. I thought that would also be good to sort of expand on, and perhaps more in respect to your own research and interests in the larger book project. Can we perhaps connect those two aspects?
That's a very good question. I mean, where does the Indian Ocean world end? So we have your regular definition coming up. It's essentially the ocean that surrounds the Indian subcontinent, starting from East Africa on the one hand, which is the Arabian Sea, and we can take it as maybe Southeast Asia. But I personally think that the Indian Ocean world is sort of different from the Indian Ocean as a physical entity. In a way, we can think about the effect of the movement of objects, but also natural resource extraction from the Indian Ocean world, radically transforming European visual cultures as well. So I would sort of separate out the Indian Ocean as a physical entity as compared to the Indian Ocean world, in the same way Brodel would have also have talked about the Mediterranean, but the Mediterranean world. So I think Brodel makes a very interesting distinction between the Mediterranean and the world of the Mediterranean. So I think the Indian Ocean, I mean, there's a lot of scholarship that has come up in terms of islands. How do we think about islands in terms of the Indian Ocean world? Where does the Indian Ocean end? On the beach? Do we track the movement of objects, ideas, people through the literal into the heartland? So I think in a way it is an expansive term, and I would hesitate to contain it in terms of a physical entity or a geographic entity. And these are a lot of interesting work, especially for scholars who work on islands, have brought this up. How do you think about islands in relationship to water bodies, oceanic spaces?
And I'm thinking, because of my own interest, I'm thinking about the extension of those who also pass through these worlds. And so obviously there's sort of networks of colonialism. You've mentioned Nagasaki, and I know some of your new projects kind of connecting into parts that we wouldn't typically think of as part of the Indian Ocean, but certainly we're very much connected to these sorts of flows and intersections. On the question of flows and intersections, we also have a question here about the materials of art. So our audience member asks, going a bit beyond the scope of your lecture today, could you comment on non-human animals, not only as the subjects of representation, but also the materials of art? Ivory, vellum, feathers, pigments. And I know that this is something that's very much of interest in your project, so it's good to open up that aspect of perhaps where some of this work is also going. So how does animal as both subject and material enrich or complicate the ideas you presented about animals in art and cultural history and the anthropocentric archive?
No, that's a very important question. And we can think of not just, I hate the word exotic, but I still have to come with a better word, but not just material from elsewhere, but also within autochthonous material from within the subcontinent. I mean, we know that animal beetle, like you would, the use of animals as a resource for art making. And there is a lot of interest. I mean, cochineal is a very good example. Cochineal from the Americas that travels across the Islamic and South Asian world that makes the red that we know from the early modern period. So there is a lot of interesting work that has been done on this sort of an extractive history. That is, how do you extract the material of art making from the natural world? But I personally think that a more animal studies perspective, or a more eco-critical perspective, is not just about extractive. It's not just a history of extraction. While that is certainly important, it's important to track how the cruelty to animals that led to the production of beautiful art, the cruelty to non-human worlds that really led to the production of this painting, but also to think about other ways in which the non-human animal enters into our imagination, into our world, not just as a resource. Because if we forever think of the natural world as a resource, it is an early modern colonial sort of narrative, which is where human and non-human resources are for our pleasure. So I think for me, it is, while that history is important, to track that in history, to see how animals were converted into brushes, and all of that history is so important. But for me, it is also important to move beyond just a history of extraction and try to think about how the non-human acts as a pressure into what has always been conceived as sort of the domain of the human. The domain of creativity has always been allocated to the human species. So what happens when the animal pressures that domain, not just as a resource, but as a corporeal being? I wouldn't use the word subject because I'm concerned about using subjectivity here, but certainly as a corporeal being. And what sort of new histories can emerge when we start taking the sentience of stone? Stone not just as a resource, stone as a sentient being, or the turkey here. So I think for me, there is such immense interesting scholarship on natural resource extraction, but I think eco-critical perspectives might take it a step further and think about a different relationship with that non-human.
I'm putting aside the question of the non-human archive. We have two questions that we'll get to, just for the benefit also of those who posed them very early on, because that is also one of my questions. And you suggested very early in your talk about moving beyond, a kind of non-human humanities, and obviously there's a loop there that we need to address. But first, there's two questions here that relate more, again, specifically to the forms of representation that you discussed, and particularly the idea of figure and ground. And so taking us, again, somewhat safely into art historical territory, perhaps. But there's one question is about vegetation. So you suggested the alienation of the turkey from the physical context in Mansur's paintings makes connections with the notion of specimen logic that's emerging in 17th century Europe and elsewhere perhaps. But are there any parallels with botanical illustration in the Mughal courts of that time or later, I would add?
There is, absolutely. And I briefly, I'm sorry, my PowerPoint was messed up for some reason. I was pressing a wrong key, but I briefly showed an example of a painting by Mansur, and he was known for his paintings of plants that we know was based on a European nature study. It's a precise copy of the European natural study that was circulating. So certainly, it was not just the animal archive, but there's a plant archive, there's a botanic archive as well. Now, Oliver, do you want to add something to it?
I remember very clearly that that slide, and my question there was whether you know if these plant species were all external, were they all sort of foreign to Mansur's context, or, and I guess my interest there is, was he reproducing perhaps from this print because the specimens themselves were not in his context, or was it perhaps the facility of being able to work from an existing visual model? Do you know about
right?
distinction?
So we know that at this moment we have certain plants like the pineapple coming in. We have marigold coming in. We have certain American plants entering, both in terms of sort of history of gardening, but also into visual representations. But the specific ones that we see here were based on tulips that Mansur that's what the Jahangirnama tells us, that Mansur perhaps saw in Kashmir. So yes, it was both indigenous plants, but also plants coming in from other parts of the world, mostly again Americas at this point. But in a way, it's also a sort of a philosophical question in trying to think about what does the specimen logic mean in South Asia, in a context where let's say the Mughal emperors were not traveling across oceanic spaces and colonizing others. So does the similarity in visual representation suggest a same specimen logic? Because we know that the economic histories, we are very clear that it's a redistributive economy. Whatever was earned was redistributed within South Asia, as compared to, let's say, the extractive economies of colonialism, whether it's the VOC, whether it's the British. So if we try to think about the two economic systems that generate similar visual practices, then are they the same? Or do we have to have a different analytical category to understand the specimen logic in a system where it's not about colonizing both of the human and the non-human world of other places? So I think that is sort of the philosophical question that I'm trying to address in my book, is that what does science mean then? If we are trying to think about scientificism in the early modern period as a technique of mapping, knowing, governing the other, whether it's the human or the non-human, what does science mean in a context where it was not a seaborne colonial project, but it was a project of redistribution?
That's, I may skip to a question that's just come up that perhaps allows a different perspective to what you were talking about there, on the question of empire, this question, because that's something that also I was very aware that a lot of the circulation that you're talking about, either between animals and prints, is happening between courts, and that's perhaps a structuring perspective. So this question asks, can the turkey also be part of a global menagerie in which Jahangir, as the world conqueror and naturalist, is competing with other intercontinental empires to understand the totality of nature better than other powers? So there's a sense of competition that's perhaps different to the perspective on extraction that you've just described, but that might be between sort of imperial visions and power. We have two questions that point to this problem, the problematic or the problem of the non-human archive. I'll try and combine both, but the first one poses the question like this: is there a way to think of the animal as subject in any historical archive, art or otherwise? Will we not be seeking a fundamental redefinition of history beyond its production through and manifestation as linguistic discourse? And in a similar way, perhaps another question poses it like this, that you noted the lack of animals in art history's human-oriented archive. I was wondering if you could speculate about what a non-human archive might look like, what techniques might be needed to decode it. So, very much both of them pointing to the kind of the language or the medium of that archive, perhaps.
So I mean, to answer the first question, so of course, we can think of animals as subjects or agents in history's archive, and there is so much interesting work that's been done about animals as actors. But we are also talking about art history. We're talking about artistic practice. We're talking about, in a very unless I mentioned, unless we take a Congo for an example, or elephants painting in Thailand as an example. We go into this fundamental question of then what is art? Is an animal making a mark an aesthetic judgment? And is that art? And if that is art, then we certainly can talk about the animal as a subject in art history. So in a way, that opens up all sorts of questions about where does art begin and where does art end? And do we think, do animals have an aesthetic judgment? I'm not going to Kant here, but even at a basic level, does certainly the notion of play is important, and a lot of animal studies perspective talk about animal play. So I sort of would turn to this question and ask, is that what is art history's archive then? And can we have a non-human subject within the domain of art history? That is one aspect. The other aspect is also to be specific about the turkey then. The turkey belongs to a certain is not, let's say, a horse. Whereas, again, one has to think about the distinctions between animals, because horses, serpents, these certain animals have a long resonances within, let's say, South Asian subcontinental cultures going back to the 1st century. But how do you talk about an animal that does not belong? So for me, both the question of art history's archive, but also the question of unbelongingness. There is no language through which I speak with a turkey in the same way I speak with a horse, or I speak with a serpent, or I speak with Hanuman as a god. So Hanuman certainly has agency and is a major actor in even contemporary right-wing politics on our side. But do we talk about the turkey the same way as the god Hanuman? That's where I think the question of the question of difference, and difference is important here, is that we also must not conflate all animal species within a certain sort of easy narrative of human-animal encounters, because certain animals are not beloved. Germs are not beloved. Certain species are beloved. There's a lot of scholarship about cuteness and belonging as compared to, let's say, a cockroach or a germ, or in this context, a turkey. There is no language to even speak to the turkey in the way I or anyone could speak to a monkey or my dog, for instance.
He's trying very hard, or she.
He's trying very hard.
I did have that in mind. There's an irony and yet a serendipity, perhaps, that we should be listening to him. But it brings up, on the question of language, and here I know we're running very close to time, and this is perhaps a big point to kind of end on. But on the question of language, there's another point here about the implications of deploying terms such as double alterity and subalternity. These questions are very much rooted to redefinitions, reevaluations of our own human archive and human politics. So the question here is, insofar, what's the implications there to refer to the subjective positions of non-human animals, insofar as the politics within which such terms originates remains, highly inflamed or deeply painful in unresolved within human societies. Can you comment a little bit on, I guess I imagine that you have posed yourself these questions in writing in this way, and at the very beginning I suggested a certain poetics in your work. Can you comment more about this particular point, but I guess the action of language in the sort of work that you're doing?
Right, and thank you for that question. I would let me begin by stating that I am not trying to conflate the subaltern. Obviously, when I'm talking about double-edged heritage, subaltern, I'm referring to Spivak's work. So I am not here trying to conflate the subject position of a subaltern within, let's say, a Spivakian analysis to the animal. But I am obviously drawing on the methods that Spivak offers in trying to think about what does subalternity mean here, and alterity mean here. I mean, again, subalternity is both in terms of the hierarchies of power between the human and the animal, but also the hierarchies of positionality within the animal world that we see, let's say, with various sorts of animals. And I think language is so important. I mean, that is why it's about the turkey's gobble. It is always about misrecognition and the turkey has always misrecognized. The turkey is always from elsewhere because we do not have because we do not share a language, or purportedly we do not share a language. And I think this question of misrecognition and othering, both othering in terms of the non-human, but othering in terms of that animal that cannot fit within our narratives of human-animal encounters, is grounded in this idea of the gobble. And it is not a coincidence that in English we say it's the gobble of a turkey, that language cannot be heard. The language, even what the turkey says, cannot be, we do not understand what the turkey says. And that is perhaps also Spivak's argument in a way where she talks about the subaltern and that we cannot hear the subaltern speak. So the subaltern might speak, but we cannot hear the subaltern speak. In the same way, we cannot hear the turkey because our paradigms of interspecies linguistic communication, there is no space for this new animal from across the Oceanic, across the world, from Peru, for instance. So I think in a way, for me, the introduction, America becomes so interesting in this story because it takes us beyond the longitudinal histories of Eurasia. I mean, if you're talking about horses, if you're talking about all of these animals, there is a long history in Eurasia starting from the 1st century where the horse or the elephant or these animals have always been deeply intertwined, both in terms of trading networks, but also in terms of mythopoetics. Alexander, for instance, in terms of thinking about the elephant or the elephant going to Rome. But when we talk about the so-called New World, it's boom, a new thing. There are new animals, new plants we've never seen before. And that's where I think it becomes important that is where I think is what is interesting in this particular story, is that what happens when new animals are entering into our framework that do not belong to that longer history, that longer poetics of relation.
We have another question here about a similar sort of situation in the art history of Australia, of course. There's a comment about similar sorts of problematics of British artists, the challenges that they faced, and British and others in the context of Australia. But I recognize very much over time, you've been very generous trying to also overcome technical difficulties to persist in our rich discussion of the questions. I want to really thank you very much for sharing this new current project. And thanks very much also to our audience for the many questions. I hope I managed to get around most of them. And I welcome people to also come back to the talk, which will be online soon. So with that, my thanks again to Sugata and to our partners, and I wish you all a very good day or evening, and stay safe and well.